mid-October 2025, Moscow's once indispensable rail empire, Russian Railways, or RZD, teetered on the brink of collapse under a staggering 3.36 trillion ruble debt, a figure that now dwarfs the GDP of several European microstates. Western economists are calling it a slow-motion implosion of the veins of Russia's economy. But the question hanging over Kremlin analysts today is chilling. How did the very lifeline that kept Putin's Russia moving become the instrument of its paralysis? For millions of Russians, the sudden unraveling of RZD is more than a financial crisis. It is a national trauma. The domino effect analysis reveals how the collapse of this single institution sends shockwaves through every artery of the Russian state. Freight deliveries halt, factories stand idle, and fuel supply chains falter, causing energy shortfalls across Siberia and the Urals. Reuters reported this week that several metallurgical plants in Magnitogorsk and Cherepovets have already reduced output by 20%, citing logistical disruptions linked to RZD's debt emergency. From the Arctic ports to the Black Sea, the trains that once carried oil, coal, and tanks are no longer running on time. According to a leaked Ministry of Transport memo obtained by the BBC Moscow bureau, unpaid freight operators have begun withholding deliveries of military supplies. This exposes the very contradiction at the heart of the Kremlin's war logic, the strategic contrast perspective in motion. A war meant to project power abroad is now hollowing out Russia's logistical heartland at home. As Defense News analysts wrote, the Russian military's logistical bloodstream is self-clotting. The opportunity cost perspective adds another layer to this crisis. Every ruble diverted to prop up the collapsing railway could have funded precision-guided munitions, frontline medical units, or the long-delayed modernization of the Su-34 bomber fleet. Instead, the Kremlin now faces the impossible choice between subsidizing a bankrupt rail empire and sustaining its war machine in Ukraine. Each bailout means fewer resources for the battlefield, fewer resources for civilians, and more resentment simmering across the 11 time zones that RZD once united. Al Jazeera's recent feature described RZD's downfall as a microcosm of Russia's broader implosion, comparing it to the disintegration of Soviet collective farms in the early 1990s. Indeed, the symbolism runs deep. For decades, RZD was the tangible embodiment of Putin's social contract stability, wages, and belonging in exchange for political silence. Now that contract lies shredded beneath collapsing bridges and silent stations. And the most haunting irony, RZD's modern freight hubs, once used to ship military hardware toward Ukraine, now serve as the dumping grounds for thousands of idle rail cars rusting under October rain. Satellite imagery published by the New York Times confirms hundreds of kilometers of unused wagons stretching like a steel graveyard outside Yekaterinburg and Novosibirsk. Western experts warn that the collapse may trigger a wider domino recession, as Russia's logistics and export systems are so interdependent that even minor rail disruptions ripple across the entire economy. DW's economic correspondent noted, "What we're seeing is not an isolated bankruptcy, it's the early stage of systemic failure. If Russia's circulatory system stops pumping, the entire body politic begins to suffocate. Factories starve for raw materials. Regional governments lose tax revenue. Unemployment surges, and the once untouchable aura of Kremlin control begins to fracture." So how will the Kremlin contain a crisis that is no longer financial but existential? Meanwhile, as workers across the rail network brace for mass layoffs, the human toll of this implosion begins to unfold, an economic avalanche that turns loyal employees into victims of their own nation's ambitions. By late October 2025, the reality had sunk in. More than 700,000 RZD employees, train engineers, mechanics, conductors, and dispatchers were either placed on unpaid leave or dismissed outright. Entire towns that depended on the railway's heartbeat fell silent overnight. What had once been Russia's proudest workforce now faced a winter without paychecks, heating, or hope. How does a nation built on movement survive when its wheels stop turning? The human fallout was catastrophic. BBC News reported that more than 2 million people, including family members of railway staff, were now directly affected. In regions such as Kemerovo and Novgorod, where up to 60% of local jobs rely on the railway unemployment lines snaked outside shuttered stations, small markets, closed schools, suspended classes, and hospitals that had once been funded by RZD's internal social programs ran out of medical supplies. It feels like the lifeblood of our community has been drained, one teacher told DW. From the domino effect perspective, this collapse extended far beyond lost wages. When one railway district goes dark, its suppliers, steel plants, coal mines, and repair depots begin to fold as well. A single broken link in RZD's network cascades into hundreds of other failures. The Guardian's economics desk likened the situation to watching a single organ failure trigger a complete systemic collapse. The opportunity cost perspective exposes another cruel trade-off. While the Kremlin quietly allocates emergency subsidies to sustain RZD's core freight routes, provincial hospitals and housing projects lose funding. Defense News analysis shows that regional development grants in the Volga Federal District have been slashed by 40% since August 2025. Each ruble saved for the railway deepens the social deficit elsewhere: pensions, delayed roads, unrepaired schools, unheated. At the same time, Russia's propagandists scramble to preserve the illusion of control. State television insists that the layoffs are temporary optimization, even as independent outlets like Meduza and Novaya Gazeta Europe publish testimonies of workers selling their uniforms online to afford groceries. This is no longer an economic story, it's a humanitarian one, noted Al Jazeera correspondent Stepan Kolesnikov. Sociologists warn that the psychological rupture could be irreversible. For decades, RZD symbolized what many Russians called Putin's promise, a social safety net that outlived Soviet chaos. The moment that safety vanished, trust in the Kremlin began to evaporate. As NYT analyst Peter Baker wrote, "When the rails stop, the narrative stops." From a strategic contrast perspective, this domestic implosion undercuts Moscow's foreign ambitions. The Kremlin spends billions expanding military rail logistics toward occupied Ukrainian territories, while its own hinterland withers. Western intelligence reports show that resources once dedicated to upgrading rail lines for troop transport have been redirected to emergency food shipments for civilians, a silent admission that the state can no longer feed both its army and its people. Yet the social damage keeps spreading. Reuters confirmed that in Siberia's industrial towns, suicide rates among newly unemployed men have risen by 18% since June. Local mayors plead for federal aid, but Moscow's attention remains fixed on the front lines. Still, amid the despair, whispers of defiance grow louder. Online forums once used for scheduling train shifts now host discussions about strikes and protest marches. "We built this country's backbone," one engineer wrote, "and they broke it." What began as a financial implosion now mutates into a social volcano. And as this anger simmers beneath the snow-covered provinces, Kremlin strategists fear the next phase of collapse, one that can't be fixed with rubles or propaganda. Could these silent rail towns become the fault lines of a nationwide revolt? Meanwhile, the war that triggered this downfall continues to gnaw at the system's core, exposing the rot within Russia's industrial empire. In early November 2025, a confidential report from Russia's Ministry of Industry surfaced, leaked through Western intelligence channels and verified by Reuters. It revealed what many had suspected: international sanctions and the ongoing war in Ukraine had carved fatal wounds into RZD's finances. Freight volumes plunged by 7.3%. International trade routes through Belarus and the Baltic states had frozen, and the company's net profit collapsed by 95%. The Kremlin's logistical juggernaut was bleeding out. But if the war was the spark, what had truly ignited the inferno? Under the domino effect analysis, this stage of collapse is the second domino where economic isolation multiplies the damage far beyond the initial target. Russia's railway system, once integrated with European and Asian trade, has now been severed from both. Shipments once bound for Germany's steel industry or China's electronics factories now sit idle at border depots. According to the BBC's Europe desk, over 40,000 freight containers are stranded in customs warehouses, unable to move due to sanction restrictions on dual-use goods. Each container represents not just cargo, but lost contracts, lost currency, and lost credibility. Meanwhile, Moscow's effort to reroute logistics through Iran and the Caspian corridor has faltered. Defense News reports that the newly built Rasht-Astara railway, designed to bypass Western sanctions, remains incomplete due to supply shortages in critical Western-made sensors and control systems. Without these imported technologies, even the most ambitious Russian infrastructure projects stall. From the opportunity cost perspective, the trade-offs are staggering. To stabilize RZD's military logistics wing, the Kremlin diverted funds earmarked for its domestic economy, forcing budget cuts across healthcare and education. A DW investigation revealed that federal spending on civilian transport infrastructure has been cut by 33% since February 2024, as more than 1 trillion rubles were funneled toward wartime logistics. The irony is brutal. The railway that once symbolized unity is now a casualty of division. The strategic contrast perspective exposes perhaps the darkest contradiction. The war meant to cement Russia's dominance over Eastern Europe has instead left its infrastructure dependent on outdated Soviet-era systems. Western sanctions block the import of microprocessors and GPS modules required for modern signaling, forcing engineers to cannibalize old parts. It's like trying to run a 21st century war on 1980s rails, said retired British Army logistics expert Colunter's Andrew Mitchell in an interview with Al Jazeera. These structural failures ripple outward. Ukraine's continued strikes on energy hubs, such as the September 2025 drone attacks on refineries in Bryansk and Belgorod, compound Russia's logistics nightmare. With every refinery fire, RZD's diesel reserves shrink. Each train that doesn't move deepens the fuel crisis and further erodes military supply lines to the front. And while the Kremlin frames this as temporary economic turbulence, Western analysts warn of a deeper systemic breakdown. According to the New York Times, RZD's debts have reached a point where default is no longer theoretical. Foreign investors have abandoned Russian bonds, entirely leaving Moscow to print rubles to sustain the illusion of solvency. But this illusion can't last. The rail crisis is no longer confined to balance sheets. It has seeped into public morale. When workers lose their jobs, the social contract fractures. When trains stop, the myth of power collapses, noted DW economic correspondent Jens Müller. The dominoes keep falling. As freight stagnates and revenues vanish, the next victims emerge: the mono-industry towns that relied on RZD's existence for survival. If the arteries of Russia are closing, what happens to the towns that depend on its pulse? Meanwhile, far from Moscow's political chambers, the industrial heartlands of the Urals and Siberia are beginning to fade into ghost towns, eerily silent reminders of a crumbling empire. By mid-November 2025, satellite images analyzed by The Guardian revealed a disturbing new reality. Entire stretches of Russia's interior, from the Urals to the Siberian plains, were dimming. Hundreds of once thriving rail towns had gone dark. Their station lights extinguished, their platforms deserted. This is the ghost belt of modern Russia, where RZD's collapse has erased not just jobs, but entire ways of life. How does a superpower maintain control when its heartland is hollowing out in silence? From the domino effect perspective, the shutdown of one rail district instantly paralyzes dozens of dependent settlements. The Monogorod's single-industry towns have become economic black holes. DW reports that in Krasnoyarsk Krai alone, 37% of small businesses have closed since August, unable to ship goods or receive supplies. Without freight factories, stop. Without factories, the local economy suffocates. It's a cascading extinction, observed an economist quoted by Reuters. Each workshop closure triggers layoffs in schools, hospitals, and municipal offices, the social glue dissolving thread by thread. The opportunity cost perspective paints an equally grim picture. To mitigate unrest, the Kremlin has begun subsidizing emergency food shipments to isolated rail towns. But these humanitarian convoys draw on the same budget once reserved for defense procurement and regional development. According to Defense News, 2 planned upgrades to the Iskander-M missile network were postponed this quarter, as funds were redirected to domestic relief. Russia, in short, is paying for internal stability with external weakness. The more it spends to pacify hungry citizens, the less it can spend to project military power. Meanwhile, the strategic contrast perspective exposes a haunting contradiction. Vladimir Putin launched his war to secure economic dominance and national pride. Yet his policy has produced deserts of despair inside his own borders. Russia's empire now retreats not at the front line, but at the rail yard, wrote NYT analyst Neil McFarquhar. The symbolism is crushing engines, once carrying troops to the front, now rust behind locked fences, their wheels frozen in permafrost. Western observers describe these abandoned zones as a Soviet Chernobyl of industry, a slow, radioactive decay of faith in the state. Al Jazeera's Moscow bureau reports mass migration from Omsk, Tula, and Chelyabinsk as young families flee in search of work. The demographic loss may be irreversible. Russia's population, already shrinking due to emigration and war casualties, now faces its steepest regional decline in 2 decades. Sociologists warn that the government's attempts to contain information blocking local media and restricting drone footage cannot mask the despair visible from space. BBC News used nighttime satellite composites to show a 12% drop in illumination across affected regions since summer, a visible signature of economic collapse. When the lights go out, so does the myth of prosperity, one analyst noted. Yet even as these regions crumble, state television boasts of resilience and self-sufficiency. The contradiction grows sharper each week, and Western intelligence sources hint that some regional governors have quietly appealed for NATO-monitored humanitarian corridors to deliver medicine, a request the Kremlin swiftly denied. If Russia's rail towns are dying, what happens when their residents no longer fear the silence? Meanwhile, deep within the Kremlin's corridors, paranoia festers. Reports emerge that Moscow is arming segments of RZD's security service, tens of thousands of men, to prepare for something far more dangerous than economic collapse. In late November 2025, an explosive revelation shook even Russia's most loyal state employees. Leaked documents from Ukrainian intelligence, later corroborated by Reuters and Al Jazeera, confirmed that the Kremlin had ordered RZD's internal security units, more than 30,000 personnel strong, to arm themselves with live weapons. For the first time in modern Russian history, a civilian company was transforming its workforce into a militarized force. But who exactly were they preparing to fight the West or their own people? From the strategic contrast perspective, this decision exposes the regime's growing fear of collapse from within. A state that once prided itself on absolute control now sees its citizens as a potential enemy. This is a regime that's gone from managing the economy to policing its own workers, remarked BBC defense analyst Jonathan Beale. What began as an economic bailout has evolved into an internal counterinsurgency. The domino effect analysis shows the chilling implications. The militarization of RZD's staff destabilizes civilian society even further. Local authorities, already powerless to handle mass unemployment, now face an armed paramilitary structure answerable only to Moscow. DW reports that several governors have quietly expressed alarm at the dual authority emerging in their regions, where RZD's gun-wielding security units patrol rail yards and warehouses once run by civilian managers. Each weapon distributed underlines the regime's distrust, turning former railwaymen into instruments of repression. The opportunity cost perspective underscores the absurdity. The cost of arming, training, and supplying these internal units, estimated by Defense News at $1.1 billion, drains resources that could have stabilized RZD's infrastructure or restored public confidence. Every rifle issued means fewer rubles for fuel hospital repairs or workers' compensation. As Western analysts point out, the Kremlin's priorities have inverted. Instead of rebuilding the rails that keep Russia connected, it is building a shield against its own people. This internal militarization also carries dangerous strategic consequences for the West. NATO intelligence briefings obtained by The Guardian warn that the Kremlin's decision to weaponize industrial labor could spill into border regions, potentially merging industrial security with territorial defense. The blurred line between civilian and military assets complicates future deterrence strategy, said retired U.S. Army Colonel Mark Peterson. For Washington now under President Trump's administration, the situation demands careful calibration, supporting deterrence without escalating confrontation. Inside, Russia fear and resentment simmer. Social media platforms, despite censorship, circulate videos of former conductors drilling in uniforms under banners reading "Defend Stability." Yet the irony is inescapable. Those same workers are defending the system that robbed them of jobs, homes, and dignity. They call us patriots, one former engineer told Al Jazeera, but they arm us against our neighbors. Western experts see this as the final rupture of Putin's social contract. The state once promised security in exchange for loyalty. Now it offers only surveillance and coercion. Political scientist Tatiana Stanovaya wrote in the NYT that the Kremlin has replaced paternalism with paranoia. The militarization of RZD reveals more than panic. It signifies a transition from governance to siege mentality. The government's greatest threat is no longer NATO or Kiev, but the 700,000 unemployed railwaymen who understand how to shut down the nation's arteries with a single coordinated strike. If Russia must arm its own citizens to prevent rebellion, how close is it to losing them altogether? Meanwhile, as this silent civil war brews in the shadows, the deeper rupture becomes visible, the collapse of Putin's unspoken pact with the Russian people, a breach that no amount of force can repair. By December 2025, even Kremlin insiders could no longer deny it. The old Russian social contract was dead. For a quarter of a century, Vladimir Putin's rule had relied on a brutal but clear bargain: you surrender political freedom, and in return, the state guarantees stability. That pact was the invisible spine of Russian society. Now, as 700,000 railway workers stand abandoned in unemployment lines and entire provinces sink into despair, the spine has snapped. What happens when the regime that promised stability becomes the source of chaos itself? The domino effect analysis now completes its grim circle. RZD's collapse has triggered failures in agriculture, metallurgy, and energy distribution. Grain shipments to Asia are stalled, cutting off vital export income. According to Reuters, coal deliveries from Kuzbass to domestic power plants have dropped by 22%, forcing rolling blackouts in 4 regions. Each power failure fuels public anger, deepening what analysts at DW call a cascading crisis of confidence. Russia's once mighty industrial ecosystem designed to sustain war is now cannibalizing itself to stay alive. From the opportunity cost perspective, the Kremlin faces a no-win equation. The money used to bail out RZD over 2 trillion rubles so far could have funded 2 years of pension payments or modernized half the nation's hospitals. Instead, these funds vanish into the abyss of corruption and emergency defense budgets. Western analysts note that this forced reallocation not only weakens Russia's domestic infrastructure, but also delays crucial weapons programs. Every ruble spent on internal pacification is a ruble lost to external deterrence, said Defense News contributor Colonel Richard Kemp. And under the strategic contrast perspective, the tragedy becomes undeniable. Putin's war to restore Russian greatness has instead eroded the very foundations of that power. The empire he sought to rebuild now corrodes from within industry's collapsing social order, disintegrating, and fear replacing loyalty. Russia's greatest enemy is not NATO or Ukraine, it is entropy, wrote the New York Times Moscow correspondent in a recent editorial. Across the 11 time zones of this wounded nation, RZD's silence is the loudest sound. Stations that once bustled with families and soldiers now echo only with wind. Young workers flee to Kazakhstan and Georgia, joining a new wave of economic refugees. Meanwhile, older generations tied to their decaying towns survive on savings and nostalgia. Sociologists describe this as the ghost generation, citizens trapped between the ruins of Soviet security and the false promises of Putinism. Internationally, NATO strategists are watching closely. The Pentagon's October assessment cited Russia's internal disintegration as a potential strategic vulnerability, noting that any large-scale unrest among industrial workers could alter Moscow's global posture. Yet officials in Washington under President Trump's administration remain cautious. A crumbling Russia is not necessarily a safer one, warned an Al Jazeera panel featuring former CIA analyst Paul Goebel. Internal chaos in a nuclear state carries its own risks. As the Kremlin tightens its grip, the illusion of unity fractures further. Propaganda grows louder, but fewer people listen. The rusted tracks of RZD now symbolize something greater, the death of the unspoken faith that once bound Russians to their ruler. And so the story returns to where it began, the collapse of a company that became the collapse of a system. The ticking of this social time bomb echoes from Moscow to Vladivostok, its fuse already burning. When will the final detonation come? And will the Kremlin still call it stability when it does? Meanwhile, the world watches a superpower's decay unfold in real time, wondering if this implosion will end in reform repression or something far more unpredictable.